Before we get into it, I just want to check myself and say I have some bias on this one. This is a guy who I look up to as an Eagle Scout. And yes, some of the conflicts we talk about in this video had terrible things happen during them. But at the same time, if you hold everyone to the standards we hold people to today, there are no heroes in this world. With that, let's get into the video. The late 19th and early 20th century is an era known for hundreds or thousands of stories of heroes, villains, triumph, victories, and great losses that fill all who read the history and stories with a sense of awe. And though many of the acts taken during this time are widely seen as a black eye to the world, I personally believe that this is one of the most influential men of the last 150 years that no one knows about. Before we get into it, thank you all for watching, and please, if you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Sir Lieutenant General Robert Stephenson Smith Baden-Powell was born in Paddington, London, England on February 22nd, 1857. As the last child of his father, the Reverend Professor Baden-Powell, civilian professor of geometry at the University of Oxford, and also Church of England priest. These people got more titles than the Fast and Furious franchise. Baden-Powell was educated at Charterhouse School. He served in the British Army from 1876 to 1910 in India and Africa. He's also known for a wide variety of images that he drew during his time in the military, just showing places he was at, to enemies, to straight propaganda for the British Empire. Lieutenant Robert Baden-Powell was assigned to the 13th Hussars in India, where he was charged with the task of drawing maps of the battlefield of Maiwand, in which approximately 2,500 British forces from India went up against 25,000 Afghani. He learned and practiced a lot of bushcraft skills during his time with the Zulu in the early 1880s in the Natal province where his regiment was posted. In 1890, he was promoted to major. He was then posted in Malta while also working as an intelligence officer for the Mediterranean in 1890, under the Director of Military Intelligence. We'll come back to this, I have theories. Baden-Powell returned to Africa in 1896 and served in the Second Matabele War. Baden-Powell commanded reconnaissance in preparation for the relief effort for the siege of Bulawayo during the Second Matabele War. This is an important part of his future works because not only did he learn reconnaissance efforts in the Matapos Hills, but he also met an inspirational figure, an American scout, by the name of Frederick Russell Burnham, whom did literally everything one could do in the Old West. He was a messenger, cowboy, gold miner, U.S. oil man, U.S. spy. Literally everything. It was because of Burnham that Baden-Powell would adopt the iconic Stetson hat. However, it was because of his next campaign Baden-Powell became famous amongst the British public and the world. Before the Second Boer War in 1899, Lord Wolseley, Commander-in-Chief of the British military, whom previously failed to convince the British government to send troops to the Cape Colony, now South Africa, instead sent Baden-Powell, who was sent with a handful of officers to raise 2 regiments of mounted riflemen from Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe. Their goal was to achieve a mobile force of cavalry on the front with the Boer republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State as a sort of quick reaction force. Their government in South Africa and Britain were concerned that putting a large amount of troops in the Cape Colony would provoke the Boers, so the British forces in the territory were only given rifles and ammunition, but no artillery or horses. Luckily, most of the force that was recruited already had horses, or the British were able to buy them for the regiment, as part of their secret supply gathering. Baden-Powell decided that despite recruiting in Rhodesia, they would store their resources in the town of Mafeking. Mafeking was chosen for its location in the northern chunk of South Africa, perfectly positioned on the crossroads of major rail lines between Bulawayo and Kimberley. The town also had lots of food stores and other resources. However, Mafeking wasn't without its faults. Mafeking was isolated, exposed, and close to Boer territory. Powell was ordered to maintain a highly mobile force. However, he was aware of the single weakness of his forces, and the capability that was afforded by the number superiority of the Boers. He chose to set one of his regiments to stay and defend the cities, and after a few failed raids by other units, Baden-Powell chose to fight a purely defensive war and simply defend the city. Based on the location and intelligence gathered by his spies, he knew that Mafeking was one of the few places where the Boers would have to go if they wanted to move with any kind of speed outside of their territory, given the rail lines and major roadways that were nearby. Powell knew that the forces he had defending Mafeking was small, at about 2,000 men, including the Protectorate Regiment of about 500 men, about 300 from the Bechuanaland Rifles and the Cape Police, and a further 300 men from town. The British garrison also armed 300 natives with rifles and used them to guard the perimeter. Prior to the siege, Lord Edward Cecil formed the Mafeking Cadet Corps of boys aged 12 to 15 who acted as messengers and orderlies and released men to fight. Work to build defenses around the 6-mile perimeter of Mafeking started on September 19, 1899. The town would eventually be equipped with an extensive network of trenches and gun emplacements. President Kruger of the Boer South African Republic declared war on October 12, 1899. Under orders of General Piet Conyers, the Mafeking Railway and telegraph lines were cut the same day, and the town began to be besieged from October 13th. Mafeking was first shelled on the 16th of October after the British commanders ignored Conyers' 9 o'clock deadline to surrender. Baden-Powell, being a master of deception, would do things to prevent the Boers from attacking the city, such as having men go out in plain view of the enemy and bury fake landmines, or move large spools to convince the enemy that they had a whole bunch of barbed wire they were about to lay. Biscuit tins and acetylene lamps would be used to simulate spotlights. A howitzer was built in the Mafeking Railway workshops, and even an old cannon dated 1770, it coincidentally had BP & Co. engraved on the barrel, was pressed into service. Powell and his officers didn't just stay defensive, though. At one point, they realized that the Boers had failed to remove the railway that ran right through their camp, so they loaded an armored train up with sharpshooters and sent it on its merry way through their camp. The attack on the Boer camp using this armored train was widely successful. However, the casualties on the side of the British were too great, and they never launched an attack like that again. For the average British soldier, they had to use some very deceptive tactics in order to move around the city, since it was so exposed. Often they would dress up as women and do tasks such as gathering water or sewing to confuse the enemy. The morale of the civilian population was given great attention, and Sunday ceasefires were negotiated so that way sports, competitions, and theatrical performances could be held. Notable were the cricket matches held on Sunday. Initially, the religious sensibilities of General Jacobus Philippus Snyman, in command after Conyers departed, were offended, and he threatened to fire upon the players if they continued. Eventually, Snyman relaxed and even invited the British to play a game. Baden-Powell replied that first he had to finish the present match, in which the score was 200 days not out. Nearby, in Kimberley, the Boers decided that the town was too heavily defended to take. So on November 19th, 1899, 4,000 Boers were redeployed elsewhere. Although the siege remained and the shelling of Mafeking continued, aware of the approaching British relief columns, the Boers launched a final major attack early in the morning of May 12th that succeeded in breaching the perimeter defenses and setting fire to some of the town. On May 12th, at about 4 a.m., Field Cornet S. Eloff led a force of 240 Boers in a daring assault on Mafeking. Covered by a feint attack on the eastern side of the city, the attackers slipped between the hidden hollow and the limestone forts on the western faces of the defenses. Guided by a British deserter, they followed a path beside the Malopo River to where they entered the Stabt, the village where the native Africans lived. Eloff's party burst into the Stabt unopposed and set fire to the huts in order to signal the attacks. About 5:30 a.m., the Boers seized the police barracks in the outskirts of Mafeking, killing one and capturing the garrison's second-in-command, Colonel C.O. Hoare, and 29 others. Eloff picked up the telephone connected with the British garrison headquarters and boasted to Baden-Powell the fire had already alerted Mafeking's garrison, which responded rapidly to the crisis. The African police of the Barlong tribe had wisely stayed out of the way while Eloff's party roared through the Stabt. As soon as the Boers moved on, the 109 armed Barlong cut off Eloff's escape route. Snyman, the most solid and supine of the Boer generals, failed to support Eloff. Meanwhile, the elaborate telephone network of the town's defenses provided timely and accurate information. Major Alec Goodley and B Squadron, Protectorate Regiment, were sent to smother the attack along with D Squadron. Some armed railway employees and others, Eloff's men, were soon isolated into 3 groups. With 2 squadrons, Godley first surrounded a group of Boers holed up in a stone corral in the Stabt. These men surrendered after a few shots. Godley drove the second group off a small hill, and they mostly managed to escape. All day long, Eloff and the third group held out in a police barracks. Finally capitulating at night, the British lost 12 and had 8 wounded, mostly Africans. Boer losses were 60 dead and wounded, plus a further 108 captured. In February 1900, the British were struggling in the war until reinforcements arrived. The defense of Mafeking during the siege was seen as a major positive moment, and when the town was finally relieved, it sparked huge celebrations in Britain. People celebrated in the streets, which led to the creation of the term Mafeking, meaning to celebrate wildly and publicly. Baden-Powell, the British commander during the siege, became a national hero and was promoted to the youngest major general in the army. He was also awarded with probably my favorite British medal I've ever learned about, Companion of the Bath, and treated as a hero when he returned to Britain in 1903. In 1903, he returned to England after setting up a few units to help stabilize South Africa. He became Inspector General of the Cavalry, and he helped improve British cavalry training, particularly in reconnaissance, which gave them an edge over European rivals, although he believed they were outdated against machine guns. His superiors still saw them as essential, which led to limited effectiveness in World War I. In 1907, he was promoted to Lieutenant General, but placed on an inactive list. He was later appointed to commander of the Northumbrian Division of the Territorial Army and chose Catterick Garrison as the new headquarters. In February 1909, facing criticism over comments about Germany being a future enemy, Baden-Powell left for South America, where he received a warm welcome in Santiago, Chile. He returned to Britain in May 1909. On his return from Africa in 1903, Baden-Powell found that his military training manual, Aids to Scouting, had become a bestseller and was being used to teach the youth organizations, including Charlotte Mason's House of Education. Following his involvement in the Boys Brigade as a brigade vice president and officer in charge of its scouting section, with encouragement from Sir William Alexander Smith, Baden-Powell decided to rewrite Aids to Scouting to suit a youth readership. In August 1907, he held a camp on Brownsea Island to test out his ideas. About 20 boys attended, 8 from local boys' brigade companies, and about 12 public school boys, mostly sons of his friends. Baden-Powell was also influenced by Ernest Thompson Stetson, who founded the Woodcraft Indians. Stetson gave Baden-Powell a copy of his book, Birch Bark Roll of the Woodcraft Indians, and they met in 1906. Baden-Powell's Scouting for Boys was published in 6 installments in 1908 and were sold separately, approximately 150 million copies, as the 4th best-selling book of the 20th century. As soon as the books released, boys and girls spontaneously formed scout troops. The scout movement had started by itself, first as a national and soon international phenomenon. A rally of scouts was held at Crystal Palace in London in 1909, in which Baden-Powell met some of the first Girl Scouts, of whom 6,000 had already been registered as scouts. In 1910, Baden-Powell and his sister Agnes Baden-Powell formed the Girls Guide Association, later which would become the Girl Scouts. They created the Girl Scouts as a socially acceptable way to teach girls the same skills they were teaching the boys. In 1912, Baden-Powell started a world tour with a voyage to the Caribbean. Another passenger was Juliet Gordon Low, an American who had been running a guide company in Scotland and was returning to the U.S. Baden-Powell encouraged her to found the Girl Scouts of the USA. The scouting movement was well and truly alive, but no one was sure what to make of it. As it stood, it was a fun organization in which kids were taught bushcraft and survival skills. Then, June 28th, 1914, a day that changed the course of human history. A Serbian student shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which kicked off World War I. And almost immediately, the Scouts stepped up. When the German Zeppelins bombed London, the Scouts were providing medical aid and carrying stretchers. They had ambulances with Boy Scouts on the side. They guarded POWs and led evacuations. But not just boys, girls, and people of all race, religion, or nation, especially America and India. In the United States, Scouts created hundreds, if not thousands, of Liberty Gardens. They guarded railways and prisoners like their British counterparts. They ran messages and did so much during the war. There are accounts of Scouts getting awarded War Service Medals, which are the home front equivalent of a Distinguished Service Medal in the UK. During the war, there was 21 Victoria Crosses, which are the British equivalent to the Medal of Honor, given out to Scouts both in the armed forces and on the home front. During 4 campaigns to sell Liberty bonds in the United States, The Boy Scouts alone raised $354,859,262 in Liberty Bonds and $43 million in war stamps during the war. It was their contributions during the war that led the Scouts to be recognized by Prime Minister David Lloyd George. He stated, "It is no small matter to be proud of that the association was able to, within months of the outbreak of war, to give the most energy and intelligent help in all kinds of service. When the boyhood of a nation can give such practical proofs of its honor, straightness, and loyalty, there is not such danger of that nation going under. For these boys are in training to render service to their country as leaders in all walks of life in the future." Now, if you recall, I earlier stated that I have theories about what he did during his time working under the Director for Military Intelligence. In 1915, Baden-Powell published a book with the title of My Adventures as a Spy. He talks about many different stories in this book, but the one that sticks out the most is the time he talks about going into Belgium disguised as a bird hunter to spy on positions the Germans were building for large artillery pieces. He states, "Some years ago, a report came into the War Office that a foreign power was making gun emplacements in a position which had not been before suspected of being of military value, and they were evidently going to use it for strategical purposes. I was sent to see whether the report was true. Of course, I would not go as an officer. Suspicion would be aroused, one would see nothing, and probably get arrested as a spy. I therefore went to stay with a friendly farmer in the neighborhood, and went out shooting every day among the partridges and snipe, which abandoned me." He then goes on to talk about how he was able to walk within 10 feet of the positions built by the Germans without being noticed, as he was simply a hunter. He also talks about his favorite tactics for hiding information, especially drawings. Now, take a look at this butterfly. It's a really good drawing of a butterfly. But what if I told you, within this butterfly there is a drawing of a fort? Look closer. See it? Yep, there. That is a fort Baden-Powell drew and hid within this butterfly. You want to see another? Here's another one. In the ones we know about, he used butterflies, moths, leaves, even family crests as a way to hide secret messages and plans for forts and enemy positions. And my theory is that most of the times that he went out and did these things was when he was working for these guys on the Territorial Defense Forces. After World War I, Baden-Powell became a normal-ish member of society. He helped grow the scouting organization into what it is today, and also spoke out against communism and fascism. And hung out with his family. At least until, well, this guy rose to power, and World War II began. Hitler really didn't like the Boy Scouts. He saw them as a threat both to his Hitler Youth and to his potential legitimacy over any future claims that he made to Britain. So he had both Baden-Powell and the Scouts written into the Black Book as people to either be killed or captured. In the case of the Scouts, anyone with a uniform was to be killed. Baden-Powell and his wife Olive Baden-Powell and his 3 kids moved to Kenya in 1939. They moved to a cottage he had commissioned in Nyeri, Kenya, near Mount Kenya, where he had previously been to recuperate. The small one-room house, which he named Paxto, was located on the grounds of the Outspin Hotel, owned by Eric Sherbrooke Walker, Baden-Powell's first private secretary, and one of the first scout inspectors. Unfortunately, he would go on to die on January 8th, 1941. Baden-Powell chose to be buried in Nyeri County, Kenya, stating, "I'd rather die in Africa where my heart is than anywhere."